So I'm giving a presentation on Condorcet, who is the first singularity theorist. At least that's the claim I make. I just finished these slides this morning. I haven't given this talk before, so I'm really glad you're here to listen to my very, very bad first practice talk. But I really appreciate y'all being out here. So I gave talks on similar topics a few years ago, and I mentioned this hypothesis that I'm putting forward in this discussion in those talks, but I didn't really focus on it. And so in 2014, I started focusing on it again, and I've written a little bit about it, but I haven't talked about it. So this is the first talking on it, and I truly appreciate Susan and Lisa and everybody giving me the opportunity to talk here at ASF for it. All right, so let's talk about the singularity hypothesis. Right. So in recent decades, several scholars, including Nick Bostrom and Ray Kurzweil and Vernon Vinge and John von Neumann, have put forward models of the singularity hypothesis. There are many versions of it, but the basic idea is that rapidly growing technology and knowledge will radically change human economic, political, social, and biological structures. For example, Kurzweil, who's Google's director of engineering, asserts that in a few decades, with rapidly growing technology, human lifespans will be able to be indefinitely long. So let me say a little bit about Condorcet, right? So he's occasionally recognized as a proto-discoverer of the hypothesis based on his descriptions of it in his philosophical work. What goes unmentioned is that he actually created a mathematical model for it in his mathematical work. And sadly, much of his work, both his mathematical and his philosophical work, is not accessible in the English world because there haven't been a lot of complete English translations of them. So in this presentation, I hope to elucidate Condorcet's model of the singularity, to encourage translation, study of Condorcet's important contributions, and especially his thoughts on how to deal with the singularity, or the hypothesis. So I'm going to start a little bit with a little background on Condorcet, right? So Nicolas de Condorcet was a Frenchman who lived from 1743 to 1794. Professionally, he was a mathematician. He made significant contributions to integral calculus. In 1785, he published an essay on the application of analysis to the probability of majority decisions, and there is no complete English translation of this work. He was also very involved in the French Revolution. So he was a leading figure. Okay, so ahead of time, forgive me for my really bad French pronunciations. Maybe Jim can correct me on these. But Condorcet was a leading figure in the Girondins faction of the French Revolution. The Girondins were one of the two leading anti-royalist factions during the French Revolution. The other major anti-royalist faction was the Montagnards faction, led by Maximilien Robespierre. Just giving you an idea of how important he was among the Girondins, he basically wrote their draft of the French Constitution. And then, of course, the French Revolution was followed by the Reign of Terror, right? So when the Montagnards got a upper hand in 1793, they began a deadly purge of Girondins, which is called the Reign of Terror, which killed tens of thousands of people. That's where all the stories about guillotines that you read in Tale of Two Cities comes from. At this point, Condorcet went into hiding, and he was hiding in a Parisian home for several months between 1793 and 1794. And it was during this time that he wrote his sketch of a historical picture of the progress of the human mind. And just to give you how stressful this is, right? He's writing this all while he's in hiding. He could literally be caught the next day, and he could not be able to finish it, right? So if you think about the process under which he's writing this, it's just a mad dash, I'm sure, to just throw out his thoughts to a large extent. In any case, he was captured in 1794, and he died in prison very shortly thereafter under mysterious circumstances. Nobody knows exactly how he died, whether it was suicide or whether it was by guards, or nobody really knows for sure. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about his sketch. Right? So in Sketch, he argued that human intellectual, technological, and ethical knowledge growth are basically occurring at an exponential rate. He tried to demonstrate this within Sketch by showing that past and then contemporary human knowledge was increasing at an increasing rate. Metaphorically speaking, this isn't exactly how he did it, but it might help in terms of visualization of what's going on here. Metaphorically speaking, Sketch might be understood as a scatter plot of human knowledge against time. And that if you did a regression, you would see exponential growth, basically. That might not be helpful, but hopefully it gives you a visualization. Sketch would go on to assert that these trends could potentially occur indefinitely, leading to radical changes in human social, economic, and political biological structures. I mean, some of the things he talked about was we'd increase food production so much that we wouldn't have to really worry about hunger, and we'd have indefinitely long lives, and because of that we would have, basically continuous population growth. With some caveats, which I'll get to soon. So that's in a nutshell Sketch. So this brings us to Thomas Malthus, and Malthus is probably, especially in the Anglophone world, much more famous than Condorcet, but his famous work is a piece called Essay on the Principle of Population. What a lot of people don't realize, he actually wrote this in reaction to people like Condorcet. The full title of the first edition of the book is actually called Essay on the Principle of Population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Goodwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers. Titles used to be much longer back then. In any case, in Essay from 1798, Malthus accused Condorcet's Sketch of assuming that past performance implies future results. That is, if you just read Sketch, the basic style of the argument is that, like, we see in the past it's been growing exponentially, so therefore in the future this will project out as a trend, right? And that's a really bad causal argument. If that's all you're looking at, right? I mean, it's a good starting point to figure out like what's going on, but it's usually not considered sufficient to say that this is what's going on, that's going to happen in the future, right? But the thing is, critics like Malthus rarely read Condorcet's work on social choice, like his essay from 1785, where through a corollary to his jury theorem, he demonstrated conditions under which human knowledge could asymptotically but quickly approach perfection. That is, the probability of one of being correct. So I'm going to give a little background on Condorcet's jury theorem, right? So in the essay from 1785, Condorcet proved his jury theorem, which shows that. So these are the first 3 points here are the conditions of the jury theorem. This is the conclusion of it, right? So if the voters had a probability greater than 1/2 of correctly judging whether or not some statement is true. So each voter has the same probability of being correct individually. And then if each voter's judgment of truth is statistically independent of the other voter's judgment. So what that means is, think of it like coins, right? So like, even if all the coins have 50% chance of being, heads, how I flip 2 coins doesn't affect how I flip the other coin, right? So that's basically the idea of independence, that how the others vote doesn't affect how an individual is going to vote, right? And then if each voter sincerely expresses their judgment. So for example, if they believe the statement's true, then they're going to say it's true. If they believe it's false, they're going to vote that it's false, right? So they're voting sincerely. Then the conclusion of that is that then the majority of voters is more probably correct in its judgment about the statement than the minority. And that's kind of straightforward. A corollary of that, which I'm calling Condorcet's asymptote, is that under the conditions of the theorem, as the number of voters increases, the probability of the majority being correct quickly approaches 1. That's near certainty, probability of 100%, right? Very, very quickly. So in a sense, it means that like as your population of voters increases, you're able to get virtually certain knowledge of questions you ask, if under the conditions of the theorem, right? So before I go forward, I want to talk a little bit about like Condorcet's political philosophy, and and we're going to connect that later on with this jury theorem, right? So he was a relatively unusual political thinker for his time, in that he held a lot of beliefs that are universally held today, or commonly held today, about slavery and women and sexuality and colonialism and citizens' rights and suffrage. So, for example, he was a very avid abolitionist. He wrote at least one tract about abolition, and he was very, very much against slavery. He was also for women's rights. He believed that women, like men, were sentient and rational beings like men and should have exactly the same rights as men. He believed that there was nothing wrong with homosexuality between consenting persons. He was also against colonialism because he felt that people that were being colonized were being treated as if they had less rights than the colonists. In 1792, he wrote a Declaration of Rights, and it included freedoms of expression, freedom of religious choice, whether or not or for, because he was very non-religious, but so it was freedom to choose whether to be religious or not, or if you choose a religion, whatever you want to be. Right of all citizens to vie for public office or position. Now, this was a bigger issue back then because, like, for example, not everybody could be king, right? And there were 3 estates, right? And so the right to equal education, the right to public aid, and so forth. And he also believed in universal suffrage. So whether you were, white or non-white, whether you were a woman or a man, or whether you're peasant or noble, you should have the right to vote. So he had a lot of views that we generally hold today. One of the biggest problems in political philosophy, in the history of political philosophy, is called the collective action problem. So the collective action problem is, why should people voluntarily agree to submit to the rules of government? So various philosophers have come up with different solutions to this problem. So Plato basically, and I'm just saying these all very concisely as possible, is that basically contended that intellectual elite, the guardians, were to tell noble lies to the masses, that's the 2 lower classes within Plato's regime, and to get them to comply with the guardians' commands, and then the guardians would be able to construct society that benefited all 3 classes. I mean, the way you might be able to think about this is like, if you want to put a positive spin on it, is that like the masses are children and and the guardians are the parents, and like you lie to the kids about why they need to do certain things, so they'll actually do it, right? Like if you don't brush your teeth, the boogeyman's going to get you tonight, right? So these are lies, but they're presumably supposed to get you to do what's right. It will help you, everybody in the whole, right? So that's Plato's solution, basically. And I think most people who believe in democratic principles generally don't buy that exactly anymore. You have another solution by Thomas Hobbes, which is basically a social contract theory where we exchange our personal freedom to a sovereign, a dictator, who in exchange guarantees our security. Because in Hobbes' mind, if there's no individual that's guaranteeing our security, we're just going to be fighting each other constantly, right? So Condorcet gives another solution, basically, right? So basically, through voting, humans are able to aggregate their reason and their knowledge in a manner that makes them more accurate and allows them to make more accurate and better decisions. And these better decisions improve the lot of all humanity, such that it's better for any human to live in such a society that aggregates individual opinions rather than just to take their own individual opinions and go where they want to go. So in contemporary parlance, this is known as epistemic democracy. If you think about it, that actually kind of makes sense. So like, through the jury theorem, we talk about like, so if voters have a 51% chance of being correct individually, if they just go alone, they're only going to be right 51% of the time. But if they aggregate it over thousands upon thousands of thousands of voters, they have a very high probability, near one certainty of being correct, assuming the conditions of the jury theorem. So this is basically an argument for epistemic democracy, which is actually a very vibrant school of thought in terms of defense of democracy these days. So I'm going to give a Condorcetian argument for his collective action solution. So it will be based on texts from Condorcet. So in sketch, Condorcet contends that discovery of truth through reason is the basis of all human progress in all realms, including but not limited to the fine arts, social progress, philosophy, and science. So presumably, if any human wants any sort of improvement, then the pursuit of truth leads to it. But how can humans find truth, right? And this is where the jury theorem becomes important. So first, Condorcet believed that there were objective, moral, and empirical truths in the world. Thus, for Condorcet, voting is not done to aggregate the tastes of citizens, but rather to determine truth, rather to aggregate their knowledge. And given that Condorcet was living in a time prior to the discovery and widespread dissemination of many valued logics, there's no reason to doubt that he was using bivalent logic. It was basically a notion of like logic where you have true or false. Because there are other logics now since the 20th century where you have multiple, not just true or false, but we don't need to worry about that. That's just a small technical detail. So, recall in the jury theorem, statements are either true or false. Right? Second, for the jury theorem, voters don't have to have perfect knowledge. They just need to be sufficiently knowledgeable in order for individual voters to be more likely to be correct than otherwise. So think about this for a second, right? So if you take a statement, it's either true or false. Now, if I flip a fair coin, I have a 50% chance of being correct on whether a given statement is true or false. So I just have to be slightly better than a flip of a coin, of a fair coin, to fit under the rubric of Condorcet's jury theorem, right? Where I have better than 50% chance of being correct. So this can help explain why Condorcet felt it's very important everybody has access to free education, because this would presumably increase the individual probability of correctness to better than 50%. Third, each voter has the same probability of independently and correctly determining the state of the algorithm. By assuming that the voter has the same probability of being correct, the jury theorem basically, roughly speaking, asserts that each voter has equal weight in determining the collective opinion. This is consistent with Condorcet's views that all people, white or non-white, female or male, or noble person or peasant, has equal rights and suffrage. The assertion that individual judgments are independent of one another is consistent with Condorcet's belief that allowing each person to construct through their own independent reason their own opinions. Because if everybody's, the thing about this is that, like, for example, let's say that we have a society of, of Republicans and Democrats, and all Democrats will follow whatever, say, Chris Matthews says, and all Republicans will say what Bill O'Reilly will say, right? Even if they have higher probabilities of being correct than the rest of us, the fact that we're all doing exactly what they say basically reduces the population of voters to only 2 voters, basically. So you want to make sure that, in terms of maintaining the consistency of the theorem, you want to make sure that voters vote independently of each other under ideal circumstances. So yeah. And then, of course, Condorcet's advocacy and prediction of population growth would increase voting population sizes, and thus make them more likely to make correct judgments, right? So in summary, we can be able to look at Condorcet's political philosophy, as stated in like the sketch and other works he did on political philosophy, as a way to approach or achieve the conditions of his jury theorem. Because I think if we're perfectly realistic, it's basically impossible to have exactly the conditions of his jury theorem. But the idea is if we construct society so that we're closer to approaching those conditions, then we're better able as a society to make more correct decisions. So if we have more people independently thinking, we're closer to getting to a situation where we have better collective decision making, right? But if one only looks at Condorcet's sketch, which contains no math, discusses nothing of the jury theorem, then we completely miss Condorcet's causal model for the singularity, namely his asymptote, and it's just completely missed. So there are 2 criticisms, I see at least, that you could put against the claims of the Condorcetian argument, right? One is, if Condorcet's social choice work is the model for the accelerating increases in human knowledge and lifespans that Condorcet laid out in sketch, then why did he not mention them in sketch? And second, if Condorcet's singularity model is dependent upon population growth to approach perfect knowledge, isn't Malthus' counter arguments that there are limits to population growth, aren't they valid then, right? So with respect to the first potential criticism, there's a few things I want to mention. First, Condorcet wanted sketch to be non-technical and accessible to large numbers of people. Including math might have made sketch too technical and inaccessible for the readership he wanted. Second, sketch was written under extreme duress. I think extreme duress might even be an understatement here. And so under those conditions, he might not have organized it, and written it the best way possible. And finally, there's the issue that Condorcet doesn't seem to have resolved a potential problem with this model called what's today called Condorcet's paradox, which is basically the intransitivity of majority preference. However, since his time, thank you, ma'am. Since his time, there have been several scholars who've developed ways to overcome that intransitivity. So I'm just going to briefly explain what the intransitivity of majority preference is. So let's think of an example with 3 voters, right? So the first voter prefers A1 over A2 over A3. The second voter prefers A2 over A3 over A1. And the third voter ranks A3 over A1 over A2. Now, majority rule is very simple in the sense that, like, if more voters rank, X over Y, then X is chosen as the winner over Y, right? So let's conduct some majority rule elections with these rankings, right? So if we do A1 versus A2, notice that the first voter and the third voter prefer A1 over A2. So this means by majority rule, we're going to have the case that A1 is going to be ranked over A2. Now, if we did majority rule on A2 versus A3, we'll notice that voter 1 and voter 2 prefer A2 over A3. Now, if majority rule were a transitive voting system, then the fact that it ranks A1 over A2 and then A2 over A3 should imply by transitivity that it would rank A1 over A3, but this is not actually the case. You see, if we did A1 versus A3, notice that 2 voters, namely voter 2 and voter 3, prefer A3 over A1. So what we have here is a situation where majority rule ranks A1 over A2, A2 over A3, A3 over A1. It creates an intransitive cycle. So that was a concern with his jury theorem that he actually discovered. So let's go to the second part of the potential criticism. This is with respect to indefinite population growth, right? So in the 10th chapter of Sketch, Condorcet asserted that the rapidly growing knowledge that would lead to the end of food and resource shortages and to indefinitely long lives would basically be a boon to humanity. That was basically his thought. But of course, this could also potentially lead to unchecked population growth. Malthus contended that, in his view, that food production only grew linearly over time, while human population growth grew exponentially. So in his opinion, food shortages and other kinds of resource shortages were inevitable and would check population growth. And one thing I want to assert here and mention is that, like, it's important to note that while Malthus's population argument could be used against Condorcet's asymptote, Malthus didn't direct them towards the asymptote because he was completely unaware of them. So it's just the fact that you could use that argument against him. It's just that he wasn't aware that you could use that argument against him in that way. In the 10th chapter sketch, Condorcet himself admitted that population growth could not go on indefinitely, but tacitly asserted that humans would use family planning to prevent food and resource shortages. But the question then arises, like, well, if Condorcet is admitting that population growth is not indefinite and that it's capped in some manner, can we truly achieve asymptotically approaching perfect correctness, right? So first off, because the probability of correctness increases quickly as the number of voters increases, you can still have a relatively small population of voters with a relatively low chance of being correct individually, and still have a high probability of being collectively correct. So for example, if you have 50,000 voters, each with a 51% chance of being correct individually, assuming they meet the conditions of the theorem, you have roughly a 99.99996 chance of the majority being correct. But technically speaking, if the population is capped, then the accuracy of the majority quits approaching perfection after some point, unless, of course, the people have the opportunity to learn. And by learning, what I mean is that people have the opportunity to increase their individual probability of correctness. And with knowledge that's available today, it's very easy to modify Condorcet's asymptote to allow for a finite population of voters and still asymptotically approach perfect knowledge. Okay, so the model I construct, basically, one goal I have is kind of like this historical accuracy goal, in the sense I try to use tools only available to a mathematician that like Condorcet in his time, and want to keep it as close to his asymptote as possible while resolving his paradox and also resolving any sort of issues with limits of population growth. I mean, I'm going to be using things like indexing of variables and stuff like that they didn't use back then. But I mean, for all practical purposes, it's what would today be high school algebra. While the model could use several different voting systems to overcome the paradox and the Malthusian criticism, I'll use the one that's most similar to Condorcet's work, and I think that's approval voting, because in his last work on on voting, which he wrote in 1794, it's called On Elections. Ian MacLean, who's a leading scholar on Condorcet, argues that Condorcet was moving away from rank ordering procedures to approval voting procedures. So approval voting, just quickly, is a voting system where each voter votes on each alternative, either yes or no. If you like it, you say yes. If you don't like it, you say no. And then whichever alternative gets the most yeses wins the election. And so in the model, imagine a finite set of voters being presented with a series of statements after they vote on each statement, and they learn and move on to the next statement. So I think I won't go through all the math, because I don't want to bore y'all. But what I'll do is I'll go over the basic axioms, and I think I'll just go over the basic conclusion. If people want to talk about math, we can do that. And just keep in mind also that this is kind of like a historical puzzle, and I'm trying to keep the mathematics. Because today you could just use machine learning or something much more sophisticated and get, we can get things much more beyond this. But the idea is just to show that given the tools he had, he was very close to overcoming the Malthusian criticism and also the paradox, the Condorcet's paradox. So you just have a set of voters. You have a set of statements, and each statement is either true or false. For any given statement, each voter has a probability between 0 and 1, not 0 and not 1, but in between, of being correctly determining the state of the state of the statement. We'll call the probability that the majority of voters correctly determine the state as A. The probability that exactly half of them get it correct is B, and the probability that the majority is incorrect, we'll call that C. And then we have some axioms here, right? So this is basically Condorcet's axiom of sincerity, in that, in an election, a voter expresses the state. They vote the way they believe. So if they believe that the statement is false, then they'll vote false. If they believe it's true, they'll state it's true in their voting. Independence axiom is basically same thing before. How a voter votes on a given statement is independent of how the other voters vote on the statement. A learning axiom. So basically, the idea I want to put here is that, I'll give you an example, right? So for example, if we have two individuals, one person knows that humans are living creatures, and the other person knows that humans are animals. The probability that the person of the person that knows that humans are animals being corrected as to the question of whether or not humans are mammals or not is going to be higher than the probability for the person who only knows that humans are living creatures, right? The fact that you know that humans are animals increases your probability of being correct as to the question of whether or not they're mammals or not, right? Similarly, if one person knows that believes that humans are plants, and another person just believes that they're living creatures, the person who has the belief that they're living creatures has a higher probability of correctly determining that they're mammals than does the person who believes that they're plants, right? So the idea in terms of the learning mechanism here is that, like, if you get a statement correct, you're learning a truth, then that should increase your P. That should increase your probability of being correct on future questions. And if you get incorrect on a given question, on a given statement, then that should decrease your probability of being correct on future statements. And then if you're half and half, then it doesn't affect, right? So that's the idea behind this, right? So when the majority is correct on a given statement, then the probability of them being correct on the next statement is multiplied by Q. See, so we have P sub I plus 1, right? That's the probability of being correct on the next statement. That's equal to the probability of them being correct on this statement times the probability times Q, right? Q for this given statement, right? But if exactly half the voters get it correct, then the probabilities remain the same because they haven't really learned anything. And then if the majority chooses the wrong state, that is, they learned the wrong thing, an incorrect thing, then their probability decreases because it's basically P sub I divided by Q, right? And then basically we're going to define Q as the set of all possible Q values, right? So I'll actually give an example of this. 40 is correct, exactly half and half, and then this is majority is not correct, right? So you see that with each of these, right? So they vote, the voters vote, and then if they get correct, then their Q value for this statement becomes this. But if they're exactly half and half, their Q value becomes this, and if their majority is not correct, then their Q value becomes this. And then you can see this branching off in the future also, right? So then if they're at this point, and then the majority is correct on the next statement, then they go down to this, and this becomes a Q value on this statement, and so on and so forth. It's what they technically call a ternary tree. But basically what Q does is it specifies what all the Q values will be for a given tree, all right? For all the possible branches you can go. All right, so I'm done with that. So you can get out of the way again. Thanks. All right. So I will skip over these things. But basically, all I'll say is that, yeah, you can have a fixed population if P is greater than 1/2. Then if P is between those two values, 1/2, and that's basically the square root of 2 inversed. Then the Q value should be between 1 and 2 times P. And then if P is between the square root of 2 square root of 2 divided by 2, that's another way of expressing it, if the P value is between 1 and that, then P just has to be less than 1 over P. And then if that's always the case, for all the values on that ternary tree I just showed you, then as m approaches infinity, then the expected value of P for a given m is going to approach 1. That is certainty of knowledge, basically. Because basically what's happening, it's similar to like what happens when you have dice, right? So the expected value that you're going to get when you roll a die is 3.5. So the more number of die you have, the sum of it's going to keep increasing, right? So like if you have n number of die and you roll them, the expected value that you're going to get in terms of sum is going to be 3.5n. So for example, if you have 2 die, it's going to be 7. If you have 3 die, it's 10.5, and so forth. It gets larger as you get more and more die. So that's basically the idea here, right? That's kind of what's going on. Yeah, so that's basically the theorem expressed in English. Is that if the theorem's conditions are met, then as the number of statements voters vote on gets larger, the probability that the majority of voters is correct on each new statement approaches absolute correctness, right? And this is basically, I can probably go over this because it's just basically an overview of how the proof is done. So like, if P is greater than 1/2 and Q is greater than 1, then the expected value of P on the next statement is greater than P on this given statement. So that's pretty easy to show. So, however, if P is less than 1/2 and n is large enough, then the expected value of P on the next statement will be less than P on the current statement. So if the first P value is greater than 1/2, and it's always the case that P divided by Q is greater than 1/2, then it will never be the case that P is less than 1/2. And therefore, all you need to do, this is like this stuff you can give your high schooler. Therefore, all you need to do is solve for all Q's where P over Q is greater than 1/2 and P times Q is less than 1. You find all those values, which we did earlier, then you're done, basically. All stuff Condorcet could have done. Though he wouldn't have used indexing of variables and things like that. I mean, expected value wasn't as big back then. It got big after von Neumann and Morgenstern in the mid-20th century, but it existed, with mathematicians like Bernoulli and whatnot, and Pascal and others. All right, so the big takeaway, right? So Sketch gives the impression that Condorcet's main argument for the singularity is that given knowledge and technology in the past have grown exponentially, we should expect the same in the future. And that's a horrible causal argument, right? But obviously, if this was Condorcet's only argument, then that would be a bad argument. I would agree. I mean, it's a good necessary step towards being a good argument, but it's definitely not sufficient, right? But when we look at Condorcet's mathematical research, we see, and this is largely because a lot of his work isn't accessible in the English-speaking world, we see that he had a model for why knowledge could asymptotically approach perfection. So in terms of a Condorcetian model for singularity, things that shouldn't concern us are intransitivity of majority preference and a maximum possible population, because we can overcome those things. And these are probably the biggest concerns for somebody like Condorcet. But there still are major potential criticisms and things you'd have to deal with to try to resolve if you actually want to achieve a singularity of this type. I think one is altruism. So I think Condorcet was of the view that there were moral truths and there were empirical truths and mathematical truths, and they were all from the same kind of source and fount. But I don't think everybody, I'm not so sure about that, and I think a lot of people might not necessarily agree about that. Because, like, for example, if we set the goal as let's steal candy from babies, right? We could collectivize our knowledge through voting, and figure out the best way to steal candy from babies. And so, and you can use the theorem to find out ways to do much worse things, like killing people or committing genocide and other horrible things. So I think one thing of concern is making sure people are altruistic in their goals, so that, like, in terms of determining morality, you do it for altruistic goals. What we would generally consider altruistic goals. And actually, I want to get back to that at the end. Another issue is sincerity. So there's a very important theorem in social choice theory. Actually, let me mention what social choice theory is, because I don't think I've done that. Social choice theory is basically the mathematical study of voting systems. So one of the biggest theorems is that when you have deterministic voting systems, that's most voting systems we're dealing with, like plurality voting or instant runoff or approval voting or anything like that, there's always susceptibility in any non-trivial case to voters being insincere. So for example, in plurality voting in the 2000 election, if somebody's first preference is Nader, if they'd be sincere if they put a ballot for Nader, right? But they'd be insincere in the sense that if they vote for Gore because they think that's going to improve their outcome, because they don't think Nader's going to win, they feel that by voting for Nader, they're going to cause Bush to win, right? So Condorcet's jury theorem can fall apart if people are insincere. So you want to have a culture of sincerity so that if you want a Condorcetian model to work out, right? Another thing is knowledge. So it's important that we increase knowledge, because if knowledge isn't strong enough, the model will fail, all right? Actually, there are versions of the jury theorem today where you can have really low. So if the number of alternatives is n, that's under consideration. As long as the probability of individual voter being correct is greater than 1/n, then you can still have the jury result. Also, voters don't have to have the exact same probability of correct. It's more of an average. So if the average is greater than 50% or the average is greater than 1/n, then the jury result still follows. But knowledge is still an issue. You want to make sure it's above whatever threshold it is for the situation. And a fourth issue is independence. And this is, I think, the really hard one, because in any complex society, I don't think anybody, like, for example, I've never tested to experimentally test whether or not the Earth was round or not, I could keep, if I just use my own pure reason based on my pure own experience, I would probably argue that the Earth is flat with some sort of dome on top of it, right? Just because I've never actually circumnavigated the entire, well, technically because of a few flights, but point being is I haven't really studied it and actually proved it, right? The reason I believe it's true is just because I've heard it from people who are experts, who are geographers and whatnot. I say, yeah, the world is basically a sphere, right? So to create independence, that's a difficult issue. That's a very difficult issue. Now, there are results that have shown that people can have correlated votes and whatnot, and it can still have the result be intact. But independence is a very difficult issue to tackle. But one thing that Condorcet gives us about how to tackle morality is we can actually look at it as a way of constructing morality in a multi-religious belief or a non-religious belief society. Because if you think about it, one way I think, I don't know whether or not exactly Condorcet would actually argue this or not. He might. I think there's a good chance he would. If you think about it, social morality only exists in society where there are at least two sentient beings, right? And so any sort of morality in that sense stems only from the existence of such sentient beings, right? So one way of considering or kind of like structuring a morality with people of multiple different belief systems is to say that, okay, we just pull everybody, all sentient, if we were in theory able to pull every sentient being in all of the world in all time, right, and figure out all their beliefs, and then we could rank order them, and we could figure out what moral principles are. For example, virtually, I think if we were to pull every sentient being of all time, if we could potentially do that, then we would probably find that like most creatures would disagree, would not believe that it's right to kill another entity, living entity, unless it threatened your own existence, right, or somebody else's existence, right? Of course, we can't do that. And one way you think of it is that's the population, and the sample is the best sample we can get is the people who are adults right now who are living close to us. And then if we poll all of them, that's a sample that's the best sample we can get, and we can get our determination of what morality is from that. So for example, if I poll all adults in the world today, I'm pretty sure that I would find that the vast majority of them say you shouldn't kill people, barring some sort of defense purpose, right? And you can basically develop a morality based on just voting of sorts. And so I think this is very this is the extent to which you can extend Condorcet's ideas. I mean, probably even extend them further. But it's a very a lot of his ideas have become very, very popular in the last 50 years, and his importance has definitely increased more over the last year. So this is the bibliography. But are there any questions? All right, so I'll go with you, then you, then you. Go ahead.
So I know in the early United States, the question was between whether it was a pure democracy or a republic, and that is whether it's absolute, whatever the majority voter says goes, or if as a republic, the government should have rules built into it that says majorities of voters can't do certain things to, for example, harm the rights of minority voters.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems like Condorcet has had a commitment to human rights, which would
Yeah.
almost make him want to write, things into like the Bill of Rights, for instance, or something, the Republican approach. But you also kind of championed the virtues of democracy as a self-correcting thing. So that would almost make him a Democrat. I just kind of wonder if you've come across anything that would indicate that he ran into that conundrum like the early American philosophers did.
Well, I definitely think he ran into those issues in the French Revolution. That's very much for sure. I don't know exactly where I think Condorcet would fall in this, because his thoughts were constantly evolving over time. And at some places, it seems like he's very much just pure democracy. At other times, he's a strong believer in human rights. I mean, I think one thing he would realize is that our world isn't in a situation where we're meeting the conditions of the theorem, right? For example, people don't necessarily have independent reason to back their beliefs, or people aren't necessarily being sincere in their voting and so forth. So I think this is totally a guess, and my guess would be that he would support like some basic, and I think you can see this in his Declaration of Rights and other type of political documents, that he would back like basic human rights, and then but like let a lot of other decisions be made through voting. And actually, it's kind of funny because it's actually through defense of human rights that he actually got. So he was a strong believer, actually just like Robespierre, that execution, death penalty was wrong, right? Robespierre would later change his mind, as the Reign of Terror would demonstrate. But he was actually very adamantly against, because he just thought life was valuable, even if people have done very wrong things. So he was very much against the king. But when it came to an issue as to whether or not to execute Louis XVI or not, he was very much against it, because it's like, well, it's just a principle. We don't kill people, I mean, we should put him on trial. We should probably imprison him or something along those lines, but we shouldn't kill him, right? And that's actually what got the Montagnards very mad at him, actually. And that's actually kind of definitely what made him lose a lot of favor, actually, is that his fervent belief against the death penalty. So I think actually, when I reflect on that, it sounds like to me that like he definitely would believe more in basic human rights, even against somebody he strongly had strong beliefs against. Yeah. I mean, he definitely did not like the king, that's for sure. But he strongly believed in, no death penalty. All right, you had a question, Jim.
We have a mic. We'll use it. I mean, else either that or repeat the question.
Yeah, here we go. Mahendra, seems to me there's several problems with this thing. And I'm assuming altruism could be related to religion and such as that, which has had a great influence on society today. But also a person's interest and concern with the overall populace and the desire to follow through with voting and cooperation with something like this. And it talked about the individuals making up the pot of everything. Well,
And making up a what of what?
Making up the pot of what decides all of these things. And then you mentioned something like O'Reilly and Chris Matthews, they have their own opinions and their own followings and such. So you've got multiple groups that are forming opinions of a great mass, and which ultimately, what am I trying to say? It perverts the system basically. I mean, from the way Condorcet is proposing it. And another thing is that people have to agree with using a scientific approach to this thing, which due to altruism and religion and such as that, it just don't happen.
Yeah. So I think Condorcet would agree that there are a lot of problems in terms of applying this right now. And for example, like independence, I think is a big issue. He would agree doesn't perfectly exist, and other things. But I think the idea is what conditions do we need to have to get approach perfect knowledge, right? And then try to construct a society or societal rules that approach that, right? So for example, try to encourage a culture of sincerity and try to encourage a culture of education, try to encourage a culture of altruism, try to encourage a culture of independent thinking. And I think the idea is if you try to construct cultures that do that, you get closer to the conditions and that improves the probability on the whole. Does that make sense? So I don't think Condorcet would go strong. So we've met these conditions. No, I don't think he would agree that. But I think the idea is, we identify these conditions of what you would need to try to approach this, and then let's try to construct a society that fulfills these things. And if we do that, then we can get closer to it.
So there's the rub. How do you get people to agree with even that,
It's a struggle. I mean, these things, it took hundreds of years just to end slavery. It took even more years than that just to, roughly speaking, guarantee rights to voting to all adults. It's a very tough struggle, and a lot of it's political. A lot of it's not purely philosophical. I agree with that, but it's a struggle. Yeah, go ahead.
This poor soul was trying to find the truth from what I have understood first. And what you guys just talked about, how can we approach it, how can we find the truth and all that, and my next question would be, how is it going to benefit anybody? The truth, to find the truth, the first thing is, rather than the mathematics, I was taking notes and I have missed some of your equations. The biggest problem, as I see it, is the fact that the individual interests outweigh collective interests. We would think it is the other way around, but it is not. Unfortunately, it's not. So, which is considered the collective interests. We do have them. Animals have them. They live in groups. We live in groups. We do have collective interests because if you are too selfish, you cannot exist because you need others. So the collective interests are actually considered only to the extent that they are necessary or to support the individual interests. If we are, if we are honest about it, this is what's going on. And the poor souls who don't understand that the individual interests outweigh the collective interests, they are the altruists among us. Those are the people who offer the second cheek even, while the people who understand what is important, and it is only them, they are leading the world. Look left and right. What kind of people have success, more money, more power, more whatever, and have the say about on the others? They're not the monks. Huh? So the beginning is being honest, and the innate human trait, the selfishness, that bends the truth itself. When we talk about truth, asking these people, the different sets we had there, asking these people, of course, when you ask many people, then you will have a probability more than 50% that you're approaching the truth. Even this is, of course, skewed by the population, by what they think to be true. In different cultures, you will have different answers to the same question, and what makes it true, I don't know. So my question would be, what is the benefit of finding the truth, or what is the benefit of morality, not killing people? Well, why? Those who do sacrifice others, they are leading the world. So what benefit is it to be moral? If the current reward system that we have supports the other guys.
Okay, so I think what Condorcet would say, and I think he was actually saying this in the structure of what was going on during the French Revolution, was basically that we have a system that rewards certain or a culture or a society that rewards certain kinds of behaviors, and I think his argument would be what we want to try to do is kind of construct a society that rewards altruistic behavior and rewards. If we look beyond just the human species, we look at other species like bonobos or other types of creatures. We generally see, or I think like insect colonies, for example. You see there do exist cultures where collective goods are promoted, and so. What I think is that it depends on the culture and the society that we live in. Of course, the question is how do you construct such society, and how do you and that's a difficult question. But I think there's progress one way or the other. So for example, take a country like Switzerland has been democratic for centuries. They have a certain culture that promotes relative to other societies democratic principles. And the question is, how do you move from a society that doesn't have certain democratic principles towards one that has more democratic principles, more like honesty, altruism, things of that nature. And it's that's where the rub is, I guess. Like Jim said, that's the hard part. Yeah.